Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.
Welcome to this season 12 episode of Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we are joined today by Valerie Cassel Oliver, who is the Sidney and Francis Lewis Family Curating of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Prior to joining the folks there at VMFA, she was for 16 years at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston, where she was a senior curator. Among the shows that she has curated in the past is Double Consciousness, Black Conceptual Art Since 1970. From 2005, Cinema Remixed and Reloaded, Black Women Artists in the Moving Image with Dr. Andrea Barnell Brownlee, 2009. And Radical Presence, Black Performance in Contemporary Art, 2012, which remained on tour until 2015. But she is joining us here today to talk about the Dirty South, contemporary art, material culture, and a sonic impulse, which was organized initially by the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts and investigates the aesthetic impulses of early 20th century Black culture that have proved ubiquitous in the southern region of the US. The show ran at VMFA from May of 2021 until September 2021 and opens at the Contemporary Art Museum of Houston in early November. Also included in this work is a wonderful catalog that also comes with this wonderful exhibit, published just recently last month, September, by Duke University Press, which features contributions from a who's who of writings on the South: Regina Bradley, Charlie Braxton, Rhea Combs, Paul D. Miller, aka DJ Spooky, Fred Moten, Anthony Penn, and my man, Guthrie P. Ramsey. How are you doing today, Valerie?
God. I am well. I am above ground. My limbs are moving. My mind is active. What is there to be complaining about? It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing.
So let's start with the germs of this show. Because on the one hand, if I hear an exhibition about the Dirty South, my mind immediately doesn't go Richmond, Virginia. Right.
It is the dirtiest of the dirty South. What are you talking about? This is the epicenter.
Everybody is thinking maybe Jackson, Mississippi, and of course Atlanta, and perhaps even more organically, given some of the things that are in the show, Houston. But it's Richmond where this launches. So talk a little bit about how this show ends up at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts and you're bringing it to this space and what some of your thinking was in that regard.
Well, the show began, it had its germs and its origins in the city of Houston. And I think that is why there is such a strong Houston presence in the exhibit. But in totality, it was really my way of having an overview of understanding a new generation and a new generation's take and framing of the South. It was really looking at contemporary culture, specifically contemporary music, Southern hip hop, as a way of really reframing how people really understood their selves in the South. It was a new narrative for the South. Before contemporary hip hop, the South seemed to be really framed in the civil rights struggle. It seemed that really kind of codified. That was the narrative of the South. And here was a whole new generation creating a brand new narrative that gave the youth a very different way of moving through the world. And reclaimed a kind of sophistication and bravado for the South, for that generation. But for me, I was really looking at not just fixating it in the present, but really understanding that in creating Southern hip hop, people had to really look at the traditions of the South, whether that was musical traditions or aesthetic traditions.
There is a fearlessness about your curatorial vision in the Dirty South that obviously is refreshing in some of the most obvious ways, but even radical. For all the things that you just laid out, when we think about Southern culture, when we think about the pastoral South, which allowed us to forget about the kind of terror and violence that was part of the built environment, at least for Black folks and other folks also in the South, and continuously going back to those narratives of the civil rights movement and the kind of Black aspiration that comes immediately afterwards with the election of folks like Richard Harrington and in Birmingham and Morial and the first Morial in New Orleans and of course Maynard Jackson in Atlanta. And yes, that's part of the story, but you really do double down in this kind of contemporary moment. You let the vision of the show be led by dirty South rap, for like everything from the slab to everything else. Talk about some of the challenges of trying to articulate that vision, in the world of in the art world, right, which doesn't quite know, first of all, what to do with contemporary, has never known what to do with Black bodies in the context of the contemporary, and then to put it out there in a way in which there just simply aren't that many folks in this kind of industry, if you will, of museums and the art world that actually understand what is happening with contemporary rap in the dirty South and all these kind of elements.
Well, I mean, when you think about it as an extension up, I think, first of all, the exhibition features 102 artists. It's 140 works in the exhibition. So we're looking at a sort of intergenerational view so that it isn't fixed. It doesn't become static. There is dynamism in terms of the aesthetic traditions that go along with the times. So to really look at contemporary culture was to affix it to this trajectory, to say it's not coming out of a vacuum. Slabs do not come out of a vacuum. Slabs are part of how we express ourselves as creative people. The fact that you would see, the South, which is really dominated by car culture, and understand the slab as being a mode of expression, that it's a part of assemblage and traditions of assemblage. It also can be talked about in terms of painting, because the slabs, the paint job is everything. There's a performative element to it. There's performance that comes into it. So to connect the slab with someone like a Thornton Dial, and to connect a Thornton Dial as in conversation with someone like a Jack Whitten, who is from Bessemer, Alabama, Thornton Dial from Bessemer, Alabama, to begin to connect the dots, to really understand that these things are not isolated. They don't come out of a vacuum. It is a holistic way of seeing the world, which is a tradition that really is embedded in the South. And the narratives and the experiences as they are told really allows us to see the South as a point of origin. And that's the thing that I really wanted to connect. That is why I feel like the exhibition is important. It's not just a Southern framing. It is a framing of how America is understood in the world. You can't talk about American culture without talking about Southern culture. And you can't talk about Southern culture without talking about the African-American South. And so that is what we bring to the table. We are part of the American origin, and the aesthetics that come out of the South is part of the larger American art historical narrative as well.
Yeah, it's funny. Regina Bradley and I have been having an ongoing conversation, right? Because everything for her starts with the South, right? I'm a New Yorker, right, and with all kinds of East Coast New York, biases. But there's a way in which all Black culture is Southern culture. We just miss some of the connective tissue in that regard. And even if we want to consider things like, the immigrant communities that come into Black communities in the early 20th century, at the very least, that's the global South, that we're talking about in this context. So there's no getting away from the South in this regard. As you were pulling together the pieces for this show and articulating your vision for the show, what were some of the pieces and some of the artists that you absolutely had to have to make Dirty South work?
Oh my gosh. what were the absolute, I knew that someone like a Mildred Thompson needed to be in this exhibition. I knew someone like a Jack Whitten needed to be in this exhibition. A Sun Ra needed to be in this exhibition.
Who we don't think enough is Southern.
From Bessemer, Alabama. What's in the water down there? You know, what's near the pipe top? You know, when you think of that trilogy, you know, when you think about the sonic, when you think about quote unquote material culture, which I tried to reframe in my essay as understanding as an intuitive intellectualism. I don't like to think of them as self-taught or folk artists, vernacular artists, even though their language is closer to the ground, and vernacular to me gets closest to it. But to strip away a kind of intellectualism in how these artists move through the world, I think is wrong. And so when I look at someone like a Jack Whitten, who is academically trained from Bessemer, when I look at someone like a Sun Ra, who's out of Bessemer, who's remapped, you know, talk about, you know, opening portals in the world of jazz and music. And then you look at someone like Thornton Dial, you know, all that to me is a holy trilogy, you know. Sister Gertrude Morgan out of New Orleans. There are so many people who have singularly, iconically defined the African-American South, even though no one would think of a Jack Whitten as Southern. No one would think of a Kerry James Marshall as being influenced by his hometown of Birmingham, Alabama. G's Ben Quilters. I mean, these are, you know, really mixing it up because, you know, really affixing people back. And then even talking about the sort of up South sensibility, you know, that people are only 1, 2, 3 generations removed from the South.
Whenever we embark on projects like this, whether it's an exhibition like Dirty South or for writing books, you know, we think that we know what we're going to do, what it's going to look like at the end. Were there any surprises that you came across, you know, stuff that you didn't expect, you know, that ended up in the show, because suddenly there were connections made that you had not anticipated prior?
You know, I try to always open the space of generosity for the art to teach me, for artists to teach me. That's the beauty of working with living artists. 99% of the time, I'm always surprised. I'm always like, I thought it was going to be this, and total take stage left because there's something totally different on the horizon. So I think the way in which the reverb was so strong was a shock to me. I knew there would be conversations, but the sheer reverberation across generation work that was created from, you know, the 1930s and how it really reverbed from work that was made decades later was really beautiful surprise to me. I thought that they could inhabit a room, but the fact that they were harmonizing in a way, singing a similar tune, understanding each other, really reverbing in a way that created such a visual dynamism. I was pleasantly surprised by that. I expected it. I expected things could live aside one another. But when I look at an Alma Thomas and a Michi Meko and how they really did reverb off of one another, that was not I would love to say that it was intentional, but that was not my intent. But it was a beautiful result of them being in the same place at the same time.
I imagine there's nothing quite like curating a show and having the opportunity to watch people experience it, you know, either directly with them or just kind of laying to the side and watching people react. What have been some of the reactions to folks who came to see the space?
I think people were really surprised at how readily accessible the work was. That they were surprised in many ways. People who were seasoned veterans of going to art exhibitions were really surprised to see new faces, to really embrace an artist that they did know in a different kind of context, and have that read be somewhat different than what it is that they would have expected. To really have the ideas around the exhibition really reverberate with multiple generations, not just the youth, but with grandparents, that people all could really experience it and really be taken on a journey and experience that together in a way that they were, again, different times, different periods, but speaking, harmonizing with a song that everyone knew. That was very gratifying in so many ways. It was very affirming in so many ways.
If you could share with the audience some of your intentions about how people would move through the museum. Folks who visit museums don't think about this stuff at all. Curators think about this stuff all the time. And I always remember the first time I visited the National African American Museum in DC, because of the crowds, I didn't get to start at the bottom. Right. I started at a higher floor. And when I went back the second time and started at the bottom, it's like, oh, this is a totally different experience when you experience it the way that they laid it out. So talk about some of the intentionality from your standpoint of what you wanted the people to gather as they come into the opening room and then come to that last room, which we'll talk about in a second, right? Because I couldn't leave the last room, but we'll talk about that in a second.
Well, the experience begins in the atrium, so the way the museum was laid out and the way the exhibition was meant to be experienced is that you come into the entrance, and in the entrance, in eyesight, is the slab. And then there is a sonic element that really propels you from one spot to the next, right?
Absolutely.
And you are hearing from the vantage point of the slab. When you're standing at the slab, you are already hearing the Paul Stephen Benjamin work, Summer Breeze, which is that 1957 iteration of Billie Holiday singing Strange Fruit. And what you're hearing is the repetition of Black Body Swinging in the Southern Breeze, Black Body Swinging in the Southern Breeze. And you're hearing it. It has even though Billie Holiday has this very beautiful lift to her voice, a very kind of a light tinge to her voice, there is a bass in this particular repetitive phrasing that is so weighted that you hear it from afar. It's not very loud, but you hear it. It carries just through the acoustics of the building. And that leads you, it draws you in to the stairwell that you walk down then to go into the exhibition. And within within that well was the three sections, representations of all the three sections that people were to experience, which was looking at landscape, both the man-made and the natural landscape, looking at spaces of spirituality, and then looking finally at the Black body. So the sonic element, again, comes into play as you walk from the well into the exhibition proper, and you are greeted with Allison Janae Hamilton's work with Sissa, which is a large-scale video work, and you're hearing water.
Yeah.
And the water is so powerful, one, because it is that grand element of landscape, but it is also a mode by which we have, the bulk of Black people have crossed the Atlantic. That is how we got to the South. But it's also the kind of spiritual notion about cleansing. It carries so much weight. It carries that water. It's baptism. It really purifies you in a way. It prepares you for the journey that you are about to embark upon as you go into that first room, which is really about landscape. And the next three gallery spaces is really devoted to that, both the man-made and the natural landscape world, and how bodies have existed in that, and the role of which artists have played in representing landscape to us in all of its multiplicity. And then as you enter the last gallery concerning landscape, you're hearing this bass, which is the Nadine Robinson coronation work. And so you are drawn into that first room on spirituality, even though it is Nadine Robinson's work is around the corner, you know.
Right,
So
right.
the sonic impulse really kind of takes you and propels you along that journey, which is conceptually the way the whole exhibition has been framed, is how the sonic has really propelled us upon the journey that we've been on.
Yeah, got the chance to visit and visit with you back in June. And you know, that last room, Arthur Jafa's Love is the Message. And I could not tear myself from that space. It was really difficult physically to lift up and leave the space. There's just something really compelling about that piece. The ongoing dialogue between trauma and joy and pain and desire and aspiration that he packs into, you know, this short film. Talk about your decision to close the piece there. You know, how different it would have been to experience that, say, at a different part of the exhibition. But what does it mean to have folks, their lasting thought really is this Jafa piece?
Well, you know, love is the message is death, you know, I mean, death for renewal. You know, it is in many ways, it was a compressed version of what I had hoped people would have experienced as they journeyed throughout the exhibition. What he did in 7 minutes and so many odds of seconds was to compress the journey. And it was as if the Black Book simply came alive, right? And was, you know, edited to have the version that we live with at this current
Today.
time.
Right.
That was it. And it was really the whole of what people would have experienced in the before was simply to get to that place of saying, you have seen the multiplicity and the complexity of that experience and how it really rolls into a much larger narrative. Now this is the compression of that. And it is not gentle. It is not nice. It is totally in your face. And it really shows that there are multiple sides, multiple facets of the Black experience and how it's been framed for us, how we have reframed it for ourselves, the joy, the trauma, the spaces of release, whether that is within the form of physical exertion, whether that's in the form of a spiritual release or an ecstasy in different ways. You know, there are different modalities of how we experience trauma. There are different modalities in how we release and what the aspirations may be. Although it's complicated, it's not fixed at all, and it leaves you with the open-endedness that the journey continues, that narrative continues. So I think that is what hit people, I think, the hardest, is that from all of this, and all of these modalities exist, in case you didn't know, that the things that you see and snippets on YouTube or that gets passed through social media, that these things are all a part of a very much larger story that deals with trauma and pain and ecstasy and release, and that we are still along this journey. We are still dealing with the same issues that are the residuals from these points of origins.
The move to the Contemporary Art Museum of Houston is almost like a homecoming for the show. How do you expect it will be received differently in Houston than it was in Virginia?
Well, the architecture of space is different, and the way people will experience it will be different. There are works that will not travel with the exhibition.
Right.
So there will be some things that people won't simply get to experience and how they experience it. But, the work will still be there, and there will still be things left intact. And, the joy is just reframing it and allowing the generosity for it to exist differently in a different place and articulate itself differently in a different place, but hopefully with the same message. The core of it is the same, but the inflection and the way in which it communicates will be slightly different.
Where does it go after Houston?
Bentonville, Arkansas, to Crystal Bridges, which I'm excited about too. And then
it's a really great space. Yeah,
it's a beautiful space. And lastly, to the MCA in Denver, Colorado.
Okay. What's next for you at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts?
Never a dull moment, darling. It's constantly my inline skates constantly sitting here rubbing my feet as we speak. I'm working. We were able to acquire in partnership with the Memorial Art Gallery at the University of Rochester a 10-channel film work by Isaac Julian, which was his meditation on Frederick Douglass called Lessons of the Hour. And so I'm working for 2022, December of 2022, to present that at the museum with a publication. And after that, working with Daoud Bey, who's a photographer, to photograph. Yes, he's amazing. To photograph our slave trail that's been maintained here over centuries. And that will come together with 2 additional bodies of work that he has done on the meditation of Black bodies in this landscape, which includes his Cleveland project, which was Night Coming Tenderly Black, and the project that he's just unveiled at Prospect 5 in New Orleans, dealing with Black plantations, not Black plantations, but rather plantations in which Black bodies existed and labored on those plantations. So this will be part of that trilogy of works brought together to really talk about that journey.
Well, sounds like I'll be booking a few more trips to Richmond.
I hope so. It's always a pleasure to see you, of course.
You've been watching Left of Black. We were joined today by Valerie Cassel Oliver, who is the Sidney and Frances Lewis Family Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. And we talked about her just recently curated show, The Dirty South, Contemporary Art, Material Culture, and a Sonic Impulse, which opened at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts back in May and is opening in Houston at the Contemporary Art Museum of Houston in November. Thank you very much, Valerie, for joining us today.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. Always a pleasure, dear. Thank you for the invitation.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.